The collected works of Sri Ramana Maharshi, Vivekachudamani, continued, page 238. In the cavity of the intellect is the single truth of Brahman, distinct from being and non-being. He who remains eternally as that truth itself is never drawn back again to birth in the body. Although a man knows this to be true, the feeling of I am the doer, I am the enjoyer, arises strongly in him owing to the bondage, samsara, caused by the mighty, beginningless vasanas, innate tendencies, which often obstruct him. Curb these tendencies the moment they arise. By your own efforts, by abiding firmly in the self, by a vision of the self. Sages such as Vasishtha have declared that the withering of the vasanas is indeed liberation. Realization of the self as it is does not come through tendencies to worldly or sense activity or through prolonged study of the scriptures. To those who seek deliverance from the prison or ocean of samsara, the above threefold tendencies are iron fetters, say those who are realized. Therefore, attachment to the word, the scriptures, and the body must be given up, and it must be fully realized that the body is sustained by the force of prarabdha, past karma. You should therefore courageously renounce these attachments and strive energetically to overcome tamas by the power of sattva and rajas, then rajas through mixed sattva, then mixed sattva through pure sattva. You should do this with a firm and calm mind, held by the great texts such as That Thou Art, which proclaim the identity between the individual self and Brahman. Seek by reasoning and experience to get rid of the vasanas, so that you may have firm faith in Brahman and completely root out from the body and senses the feeling of I and mine, which constantly appears as a result of the superimposition. This is to be done by firm abidance in the one indivisible self in the heart, and by meditating on the unceasing experience of knowledge of the unity of Brahman and self. Thus, I am not the ego. I am the unceasing perfection of Brahman experienced as I, the witness of thought forms. This meditation must be persisted in until the ego sense is completely rooted out from the body, without a vestige, and the world of individuals appears like a dream. He who meditates has no work to do except beg and perform his natural functions. He must never forget the self by giving room for worldly speech and sense objects. Sandalwood is a fragrant by nature, but its fragrance is masked by a bad smell when it comes into contact with water, and is revealed when it is rubbed. Constant practice of meditation is this rubbing. The latent tendencies of the mind are removed only to the extent to which it abides in the self. It is by such constant abidance in the self that the mind of the yogi is destroyed. And by the destruction of the mind, the outer non-self tendencies of the heart are utterly eradicated. Then the experience of the Supreme Self, which was formerly veiled by the magic of the vasanas, shines forth of its own accord like the fragrance of uncontaminated sandal paste. In whatever way it may be examined, the ego with all its faculties turns out to be unreal, a momentary limitation, inert, insentient, and incapable of realizing the One. The Supreme Self is different from both gross and subtle bodies. It is the witness of the ego with its faculties and exists always, even in deep sleep. The texts say it is birthless and deathless. It is immutable and distinct alike from being and non-being. The ego can never be the real self, the true meaning of I. Keep aloof from this impure body as you would from an outcast. Give up the sense of I in the gross body and all attachment due to the mind, attachments to name and form, tribe and family, caste and social order. Give up also the attachment to the subtle body and its nature and sense of being the doer, finding the feeling of I in the self, which is truth, knowledge, and eternity. Just as the air in a pot is part of the air outside, so conceive of the self as the self-effulgent Brahman, which is the substratum of all, in which the word is seen reflected like a city in a mirror or like shadows cast. Think of yourself as that I am, without parts, without form, without activity, without duality, unending being, consciousness, bliss. Know the self as it really is. Give up this false physical self, just as an actor gives up his role and remains himself. By knowledge acquired through self-inquiry, discard both microcosm and macrocosm as unreal, and abiding in this unbroken stillness, remain ever at rest in the perfect bliss as unqualified Brahman. Thus obtain supreme peace, which is the purpose of life. Though various obstacles contribute to the bondage of the soul, the primary cause of them all is the rising of the false ego sense. It is through the superimposition of the ego on the self that this bondage of birth, death, and sorrow has come upon you, who are by nature being, consciousness, bliss, of boundless glory, eternal, single in essence, unchanging. By nature you have no such bondage. Just as there can be no sound health so long as the effect of a little poison in the body continues, so there can be no liberation so long as identification with the ego continues. Knowledge of the identity of the self with Brahman is clearly revealed as soon as the ego is completely destroyed, without residue, together with the illusion of multiplicity caused by the veiling of tamas. Therefore, by investigation into the nature of the unattached self, discover the truth of your own self, complete, perfect, self-effulgent, and ever blissful. He who is freed from the ego shines eternally as the self, like the full moon, radiant when delivered from the dragon's head of eclipse. In the field of the heart, the terrible cobra of the ego is coiled round the bliss of the self, to which it denies access with the threefold hood of the gunas. These three fearful heads of the serpent of ego are to be severed in accordance with the scriptures only by great courage with the mighty sword of actual experience of the self. He who has thus destroyed the three-hooded serpent can obtain and enjoy the vast treasure of bliss of Brahman. Therefore you too give up the I sense in the ego, which appears like beings and assumes that it is the doer, whereas it is only the reflected light of the self. Turn inwards all the thought forms that adhere to the ego. He is an enemy of yours, so kill him with the sword of knowledge. He has been harming you like a thorn in your throat while eating. Give up all desires in order to realize your state as the Supreme Self. Enjoy the kingdom of the Self. Be perfect. Be still in the stillness of the immutable state of Brahman. The ego may in this way be killed, but if thought is given to it, even for a moment, it revives and engages in activity, driving a man before it as the wind drives winter clouds. Remember that he who associates the I sense with the body and its faculties is bound, while he who does not is liberated. Thoughts of sense objects creates a sense of differentiation and thereby cause the bondage of birth and death. Therefore, no quarter should be given to the ego. Who is the enemy who has such thoughts? Just as a withered lime tree puts out new leaves if watered, so the ego revives through thoughts of sense objects. The increase of effects makes their seed or cause flourish, while the decay of effects destroy their cause also. Therefore, you should first destroy the effects. If thoughts, which are the effect, flourish, the ego with its tendencies, which is the cause, also flourishes. From thoughts, outer activities arise, and from these two together, the tendencies develop and create the bondage to which souls are subject. In order to escape from this, thoughts, activity, and tendencies must all three be abolished. The best way of doing this is to hold firmly to the view that all this that appears as separate names and forms is Brahman itself. This view must be held to at all times and places and in all states. Firm holding to this attitude reduces activity, and this results in a decline of thoughts, which in turn destroys the latent tendencies. Destruction of the latent tendencies is indeed deliverance. Therefore, develop this helpful tendency to regard everything as Brahman. The result will be that the frail tendencies of the ego will disappear, like darkness before the sun. Just as darkness with all its dismal effects disappears before the rising sun, so bondage with all its sorrows will pass away without a trace when the sun of Advaitic experience rises. Therefore, regard all objects, objective manifestation as Brahman, and hold firm in a state of peace, samadhi, and inner and outer beatitude, nischal bhav, as long as the bondage due to your past destiny karma lasts. While doing so, always remember that immovable bliss of Brahman itself am I. This abidance as Brahman must never be relaxed, for if it is, a false notion of truth will result, which is indeed death, as says Bhagavan Shri Sanat Sujata, the son of Brahma. Such a false notion of truth, due to swerving from the state of abidance in truth, introduces delusion. From delusion arises the attribution of I to the ego and its objects. From this bondage, and from bondage sorrow. Therefore, there is no greater misfortune for the enlightened than wrong understanding and swerving from reality. Just as water plants, though removed from a pool of water, do not stay at the side but cover it over again, so if a man is exteriorized, even though he may be enlightened, if Maya, illusion, once begins to shroud him, he will be swayed in numerous ways by the false intellect. This is due to his lapse from watchfulness, his forgetting of his true state, his going out towards sense objects. He is like a man swayed and dominated by a livid woman, of whom he is enamored. If through wrong understanding and swerving from reality, a man's consciousness slips even the least bit from the target of his own self, it will enter into outer things and leap from one to another as a ball slips from your hand and rolls down a flight of stairs. It will begin to consider outer experiences good for it, and thence will arise the desire to enjoy them. That will lead to participation in them, which in turn will destroy his abidance in the self, with the result that he will sink into depths from which he can never more arise and will be destroyed. Therefore, there is no greater danger in Brahman consciousness than wrong understanding, which means swerving one from one's true state. Only he who has the eternal state of consciousness, nishtha, obtains realization, siddhi, and so renounces the manifestation, sankalpa, born of pramada, wrong understanding, and of relaxation from practice. Such wrong understanding is the cause of all spiritual decline, aratha. Therefore, be the Swarup Nishtha who abides ever in the self. He who has attained liberation in the state of Brahman while still alive will shine so in his bodiless state also. It says in Yajurveda, he who has even the slightest sense of differentiation is always afraid. He who sees any attributes of differentiation, however small, in the absolute Brahman, will for that reason remain in a state of terror. He who locates the I sense in the insentient body and its objects, so despised by the various scriptures and their commentaries, will experience sorrow after sorrow like the sinner who commits unlawful acts. We can see from the discrimination between thieves and honest men that he who is devoted to truth escapes misfortunes and achieves successes, while he who is devoted to falsehood perishes. This refers to trial by ordeal, placing a hot iron in the hand of a suspected thief who is burnt if guilty but not if innocent. We also see that shutting out external objects gives the mind a clear perception of the self, which in turn results in the destruction of the bondage of samsara. Therefore, abandonment of all objective reality is the way to deliverance. If a man discriminates between truth and non-truth in quest of liberation and discovers the truth of the Supreme Lord through the authority of the scriptures, will he then like a child run after non-existent chimera, knowing them to be the cause of his destruction? None would do so. Therefore, he who discriminates must also renounce and cease to seek after externals which feed those lower tendencies that cause bondage. He should erase all sorrows due to ignorance by the experience, I am the Supreme Brahman alone, which is being, consciousness, bliss, and should abide ever in his true state, which is bliss. One who is in the waking state is not dreaming, and one who is in the dream state is not awake. The two are mutually exclusive. Similarly, one who is not attached to the body has deliverance, and one who is has not. A liberated being is one who sees himself as single, and the witness both within and without the world of things moving and unmoving as the substratum of all. By his universal consciousness, experienced through the subtle mind, he has removed all the vehicles and he remains as the absolute whole. Only such a one is liberated, and he has no attachment to the body. There is no other means of liberation than this blessed realization that all is one self, and this all is one attitude is to be obtained by perpetual abidance in the self and rejection of objects without attachment to them. How can a man reject objective reality if he has the I am the body idea and is attached to outer things and always performing actions dictated by them? It is impossible. Therefore, renounce all actions based on karma and dharma, and with knowledge of tattva, abide permanently in the self. Prepare your mind for immersion in perpetual bliss. This effort will enable you to reject objective reality. It is in order to obtain the sarvatam bhava attitude that all is the self that the scriptural text Shanto Dhanta, calm and self-controlled, prescribes nirvikalpa samadhi, ecstatic trance, for those seekers who have taken a vow of chandrayana, regulation of the increase and decrease of food intake through 2 successive fortnights, and have also performed shravana, hearing of the text that thou art. A scholar who has not had a firm experience of nirvikalpa samadhi, however learned he may be, will not be capable of destroying the ego and its objective reality, together with all the accumulated tendencies of his previous births. It is the projecting power of Maya, together with its veiling power, which unites the soul with the ego, the cause of delusion, and through its qualities keeps a man vainly dangling like a ghost. If the veiling power is destroyed, the self will shine of itself, and there will be no room either for doubt or obstruction. Then the projecting power also will vanish, or even if it persists, its persistence will only be apparent. But the projecting power cannot disappear unless the veiling power does. Only when the subject is perfectly distinguished from objects, like milk from water, will the veiling power be destroyed. Pure discrimination born of perfect knowledge distinguishes the subject from object and destroys the delusion due to ignorance. The man of discrimination distinguishes the real from the unreal, reasoning as follows: like iron combining with fire, the intellect combines with the ignorance to obtain a fictitious unity with the self, which is being, and projects itself as the word of seer, sight, and seen. Therefore, all these appearances are false, like a delusion, dream, or imagination. All sense objects from the ego down to the body are also unreal, being modifications of Prakriti, subject to change from moment to moment. Only the self never changes. The self, distinct from the body, distinct from being and non-being, the witness of the intellect, and the meaning implied by the eye sense, single, eternal, indivisible, is indeed the supreme self of eternal bliss incarnate.